Hello. My name is Tom Hall. I'm the director of the Sarasota Film Festival. Thank you so much for coming for our conversation today with Rory Kennedy. Thank you. This is the second in our conversation series. We had Frank Langella in here on Saturday. It's already Monday. It's gone so quickly. And we're going to have on next Saturday, Penelope Ann Miller will be talking to Peter Rayner of the Christian Science Monitor. At this very auditorium, 1 p.m. And then next Sunday, David Carr from the New York Times will be talking to Todd Solondz and wrapping up the conversation series noon on the 22nd. We've also added 3 screenings to the program next Sunday. At 11:15 a.m. in Theater 12, we're going to be adding a screening of Dancing on a Volcano. At 5 p.m. in Theater 10 over at the Hollywood 20, we've added a screening of The Perfect Wedding. And then at 7:30 next Sunday, we've added a screening of The Book Club. So if you're interested in seeing any of those films, we've added tickets. They're available online and at the box office, so please join us for those. I'm very excited today. We've done the conversation series now for about 5 years, and we've never had a nonfiction filmmaker really be the focus of our conversation. We did have a studio executive who had made a documentary, but no one whose career was defined by nonfiction film in the way that Rory Kennedy's career has been defined by her work. And I guess we saved the best for first. I'm really, really excited that she's here. I just want to give you a little bit of background on Rory. She's the co-founder and president of Moxie Firecracker Films for the past 12 years. And she's an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker who's produced 35 documentaries covering topics that we'll discuss today, including the global AIDS crisis, human rights, domestic abuse, poverty, drug addiction, and political corruption. So upbeat material. Her films have appeared on HBO, PBS, Lifetime, A&E, Court TV, Oxygen, and the Learning Channel. And of course, we're really proud to be showing her latest film, Ethel, at the festival. Did anyone see it yesterday? Yeah. Awesome. We have a sold-out screening tonight, and it's a really wonderful film that we're really proud to be showing. So it's my honor to have her join us on stage for conversation, Ms. Rory Kennedy. Welcome.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start our discussion with sort of where your film ended last night, which is this idea of your mother's impact as a social activist and humanitarian, and the way in which nonfiction film can really work as a tool to illuminate people about issues that are important. And I'm wondering, what got you in the very beginning of your career? What drew you to documentary film as a form for this type of work?
I was actually very much attracted to documentary filmmaking because of my interest in social advocacy. I think more so than my appreciation for the kind of art of documentary filmmaking. And I was going to Brown University. I was a women's studies major. I was doing my final project about a paper about women and substance abuse and the difficulties they were having trying to get treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, particularly for women who were pregnant or women with children. And I found as I was doing the research and talking to the women who were in this situation that what I was hearing from their personal stories was so different from what I was seeing in the press, because there were all of these articles about crack mothers having crack babies, if you recall, you know, kind of in the early 90s. And what I was hearing was that these women had tried to get treatment, they were turned away, they weren't able to get into programs because of insurance and other issues. And I really felt that if people could have access to these women and go into their living rooms like I was doing, that they would see a much more kind of nuanced, complicated, and I think truthful picture of what was actually happening. And maybe as a result of that, instead of creating responses, government responses, which were much more punitive, that we could have responses that were much more strategic and helpful. So anyway, I brought a camera out and I started interviewing them, and I made a film which was called Women of Substance, which was the first documentary I ever made, and I fell in love with the process. I really love storytelling, and I love the medium, and I really also appreciated how, you know, you could tell a story in a certain format and then get it out to a huge number of people, and felt that there was a real way to have impact in making documentaries. And so I've been doing it ever since, and I think, you know, I've really obviously grown to appreciate the art of documentary filmmaking, kind of the narrative story of it, as much as I continue to appreciate how much it can impact people and hopefully, you know, change things to some degree, or at least contribute to a change.
Do you think it doesn't operate sort of in lieu of actual action, though? It's sort of a call to action in a way. And I'm wondering, when you're conceiving or working on your projects, do you think of the long tail of the story that you're telling, what sort of change it's going to bring to the world? Is that an objective of yours in the story that you're telling?
I think it really depends on the project. I think with Ethel, it wasn't really about the impact that it would have or the effect, or kind of an advocacy position, as much as it was wanting to share her story and share her personality and character and the person who I love so much with other people in the world. But you know, there are other projects I've done, like Pandemic Facing AIDS, about the global AIDS crisis, which really was came into fruition because I was so passionate about the issue of AIDS, and because I felt like it really could make a difference. I had been asked in 1991 to go on a delegation with President Clinton to Africa, and I had to look at the AIDS crisis and to make a short film about AIDS in Africa, and particularly focusing on women and AIDS. And so I made this film. It was, you know, a 15-minute film. But it was at a time where people really weren't talking about the AIDS epidemic. But I remember meeting this woman there named Bernadette, who had 10 children, 9 of whom had died of AIDS. And she was the sole caretaker of 35 grandchildren. And, you know, here was this woman, and I thought when the delegates, people who organized this delegation had introduced us to her, they must have found the most extreme case in Africa, you know, to try to kind of jolt us into understanding. But I ended up staying with her, and the delegation moved on because I wanted to film her story. And it turned out that there was another grandmother down the street who had 8 children, all of whom had died of AIDS. And, you know, everywhere you went, there were just complete devastation and loss. And it was after that trip that I felt that, you know, what has happened in Africa with the AIDS epidemic is so horrific. And if we can learn from that and learn from that experience so that we can prevent the spread of AIDS in Asia, and, you know, we were seeing the numbers increase at very frightening paces in South America and other parts of the country, of the world, that I felt that we could really make a difference. And so on a project like that, I think Mike is going in and out, but on a project like that, it's very much about impact.
I was going to sort of go in chronological order, but you've brought this film up, and I think it's transitional film in a lot of ways for you. The sort of short portraits that make up Pandemic. I'm wondering, you know, one of the things about the history of AIDS in film as it relates to documentary film has always been, in this country, a focus on sort of activism and the spread of the disease in our country and the political ramifications of that. And yours was really the first American-made documentary that globalized the issue in a lot of ways and opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that the epidemic had not abated in the same way that it may have felt it had here. And I'm wondering, did you look at all at the sort of tradition of AIDS documentary film, or those stories, the band played on being a book version, but, you know, that sort of narrative, and try to counteract that? Or were you looking to open our eyes to the outside world? Or,
you know, I had seen a number of films, obviously documentaries and narrative films that had been done about the AIDS crisis.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to hold this bad boy. Hold on. Is that better?
They're Dominican. Sorry.
Nice to see you all. I can't really see you, but anyway, I had definitely watched a lot of these films, but and had been very moved by them, particularly I think the documentaries, and there have been a number of extraordinary documentaries done on the AIDS crisis. I think you're right, particularly in the United States. But I think it was really this experience I had with the Clinton White House, where I had this firsthand knowledge of what was going on, and I really, I had read the statistics and the numbers of how it was spreading on an international level at such extraordinary rates, and that if we could prevent it, it's so much more strategic and humane before it gets to that level in other places. So I think that it was much more about the issue than it was about a feeling of, continuing in a tradition
right.
of kind of filmmaking. So I think that was really kind of what motivated me, and it was a great project to participate in and be a part of, and I ended up filming in 5 different countries, in India and Thailand, Uganda, Russia, and Brazil. And I remember once I got the funding in place and the Gates Foundation supported it and HBO got on board, and then to try to kind of figure out how do I possibly take on this extraordinarily complicated issue, even in a single story and a single human being, let alone, all the countries in the world, and kind of representing it internationally. And I remember thinking back about my experience in Africa and remembering and knowing, all the statistics coming out of Africa at the time and how upsetting they were, but really what stuck with me was Bernadette. And was her story, and I thought, that's what I need to do, is tell one story in each of these countries that represent a different experience of what it is like to have or to live with AIDS, and so that's what I did, and I focused on individual stories in each of the countries.
Do you feel like your role in that situation is to be an advocate? Or do you think storytelling can be advocacy?
I'm pretty comfortable myself with having a film be a part of an advocacy effort. I think that you have to kind of be honest as the filmmaker of where you're coming from and what kind of film it is, and there are a lot of people who would draw a line and say that, you can't cross that line, but when you have an issue like AIDS and you can make a difference and you can kind of share these stories and have people in this country identify and cry along with a prostitute in Thailand and feel like they can really understand and empathize with her and her family and what she's going through, that's an extraordinary thing. And if you can channel the energy that comes from that in a way that enables those folks after watching it to get involved and to participate and to make a difference, I think that's extraordinary for everybody involved.
How do you let that shape your process? I think for someone like me, I was raised in Flint, Michigan, which is the home of Michael Moore. He takes a lot of heat for taking a very specific position in his films.
Right.
And people say, it's not reportage, it's an argument, or you're trying to make points
right. Instead
of trying to tell the truth, whatever that means. How do you, when you set up a project like this or something like Abu Ghraib, where's that line for you in terms of like the facts versus the narrative versus what you're trying to say?
Right. Well, I guess that's what I was sort of pointing out when I said that as long as you as a filmmaker are clear to the audience where you're coming from in the beginning, I think it's okay. And so, I feel like I can make a film about my mother, and I'm narrating it, and I'm saying I'm making a film about my mother, and right. This is my mother. It's very much a story about what it has been like to grow up with my mother and who she is and to be a part of my family. And it's not purporting to be the objective film about Ethel Kennedy,
right.
So I think I, for example, made another documentary called Indian Point, which was about the Indian Point power plant that is just north of New York City, 28 miles north of New York City, and how New York is therefore vulnerable to, terrorist attacks and whatnot on the power plant, and what that would look like and what the effect would be. And my brother Bobby is one of the biggest proponents of shutting down Indian Point. And so right out of the gates, I introduced Bobby, what his background is, how he introduced me to this topic, and how I, wanted to learn more about it after hearing him speak. And so I think if you present that in the beginning, and the audience is aware of where you're coming from, and I think Michael Moore does that. Mm-hmm. He's doing a POV piece, then you're okay.
Yeah, documentaries are always going to have a point of view, I think, is the point. You're in the editing room, you're making choices, you're removing things, you're adding voiceover music.
Yes.
It's not news. You're not doing the nightly news with a film.
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, probably the nightly news isn't very objective either.
Right, probably not.
Especially if it's Fox.
I wouldn't know. Never watched it. But I do wonder, in that case, when a lot of documentarians, for example, will go set up cameras and let the story unfold in front of them, and they will discover their story in the editing room, or they'll tackle something from that point of view. What is your process like? Because you have a wide range of films. For example, you think of something like American Hollow, whatever's going to happen with the family is going to happen with the family, and that's going to be the story. And you framed it by putting it in a certain yourself in that situation to discover and portray the family. But It's something like Abu Ghraib, you've got a series of facts, and you've got a series of people. Can you talk a little bit about the distinction, how these approaches that you have to take, and just from the beginning of the process for you?
Right. I think that, for a lot of the films that I've made, I think there is a process, particularly kind of the feature-length films, of trying to figure out what this particular film wants to be. And I think that for the films that I've made that have had kind of a larger audience and greater, perhaps, reach, are the ones that have changed pretty significantly from what I initially intended to do to what ended up, being in the film. And I think that having that kind of flexibility as you go is enormously important. For example, with American Hollow, this was a family in Appalachia that was about a mother who had 13 children and grew up in pretty severe, extreme poverty in the hills of Appalachia, and all of her children were still living basically within a 2-mile radius of her house. And that initially I had intended to do a film about welfare reform and how the changes in the welfare laws were going to impact families in Appalachia, where you still had very hardworking folks but not a lot of job opportunities, and what was going to happen in those areas. And then I met this family and I said to them, what do you think about welfare? And they were like, it's the worst thing that ever happened. It wasn't quite what I was looking for. But they were so interesting, and, their lifestyle and kind of what they represented. And I just kept staying with them because I felt like there was something there that I was trying to understand and thought was kind of fascinating. They have these huge, they had outhouses. Very few of them even had toilets in their houses, and yet they had these huge satellite TV dishes outside. So there was kind of this encroaching modern world coming upon them, but then they lived off the land, and so there were a lot of contradictions, and they were interesting, so I kind of stuck with it. And I think made, a film that was much more interesting than just a film about, a kind of more advocacy film about welfare. And I think similarly with Ghost of Abu Ghraib, that was going to be a very different film that I had pitched to HBO, and the photographs came out, and I kind of came back to them and said, can we really focus on this issue? And they were game. But so there's a lot of evolution, I guess, with some of these films. And with Ethel, I had initially imagined just a film about her in her own words, and 1-hour documentary, more present day. And then I really sat with the archival material, and I went through it all very thoroughly. And she was there every step of the way on all of these significant historical events, and then all my siblings were there, for the Hoffa hearings and for the McCarthy hearings and all these campaigns, and I really felt like the story was about understanding this history and understanding it not just from my mother's perspective but also my siblings. And so that's, then I sort of had this aha moment, like I've got to get my siblings on board with this and ask them to participate, because I think their voice is so important in this. And then as I started filming it, it was clear that it wouldn't contain itself within an hour, that it had to be longer. And, and it's great, I have to say, to work with HBO, because, as I'm making those changes which affect the budget and the schedule and other things, if I can make a compelling argument and they can see that there's potential, they're able and willing to kind of move along with me, which is rare, with other broadcasters. So I'm grateful to have them.
Can I ask you about that archival process with the film? Because, people who haven't seen the film or don't know the family history, you weren't around for any of the overwhelming majority of that movie, and the story of that film was before you were born. And I'm wondering, what it was like to see all that footage. What's your relationship to that archival material as a filmmaker and a viewer? Because you have to walk a fine line in this movie, I think, between telling your family story as a member of the family, but also the larger social context that I think surrounds your family.
Right. Well, it was hard. A lot of it was hard. A lot of it was really wonderful to see the archival materials, some of which I had seen, not all of which I had seen. It was really fun to go back through both the photographs and a lot of the moving images. I really, really enjoyed going through the home movies and kind of coming across. I had never seen, for example, any of the Skakel, my mother's side of the family, none of those home movies had I ever seen. So it was really great for me to see, her mother and father, who I'd never met, in a moving image, and some of her brothers and sisters, and the house that they grew up in. And that was a wonderful experience for me. I think also, and part of my resistance to doing a film about my family, or one about my mother in particular, is that there is a lot of sadness to the story, to our story, and it's hard to kind of revisit that, and it's not necessarily my nature or I think many members of my family to kind of revisit that. So that was hard for me to go through, but I also felt like there was again a story there about my mother that was important and worth telling, and as I sort of was able to craft it in the edit room, and I had a wonderful team, and my husband Mark Bailey was a huge part of that, and I had an extraordinary editor, Azine Samari, and we really worked together, and as I gained confidence in the story we were telling, I felt that it was really important to share it with people, and that I feel like there is this part of obviously our family has been documented a lot, and the stories have been told from a lot of different perspectives, but I felt that the perspective of my mother and from kind of an inside point of view hadn't been shared, and that it was important to not only share it but also to have her voice in it, and so that kind of helped push me along. Your family's a very public family. Does the way that they've been, and I say they, you've been portrayed in the media, and that level of attention, did that inform the way you were going to tell this story, the way you were going to ask questions and structure your own insight and look at your family? Did any of that sort of, was it a corrective quality I think
to it?
that we have, been, my family to varying degrees have been, our stories have been told, other members more than some, but I think it's hard because I grew up within that to kind of distinguish between that and not that, because I've never not had that experience, and but I think that what I was trying to tell was I mean, on a conscious level, was the story of my mother and who she is and what she represented and how her story kind of interwove with history and with these events that I think we all share, from a very particular perspective that she has. And through that also obviously include the story of my father and my siblings, because they're an integral part of her story. But that was my mission and my goal in this, and also just sharing, somebody who I think is a great personality and character. I mean, she's a character. She's very funny and witty and smart and outgoing and all of those things. And so, that was where I was coming from. That said, I'm sure the stories that have been told before and how they've been told certainly informed the way that I told my story. And in making this film, I look through the many documentaries that have been made about my father and my mother to a lesser degree. I mean, just because they're not really documentaries about my mother, but about my father and my family and my Uncle Jack. And I watched all those films to kind of understand how it had been done before and how I could basically make it better. That was my goal.
You did a great job. I do want to ask about your mother as a subject. I mean, I have a hard time talking to my mom on the phone, let alone sitting down with her forever, and trying to draw out of her. She was a tough subject for you. You guys had a great sort of rapport in this film. But she's, she pulls back when she needs to. She's a private woman, and she's a woman of faith, and you want to get certain things out of her, and I know that can be difficult as a filmmaker to try and get what you need for your story. Can you talk a little bit about the process of her as an interview subject and how you handled that as her daughter?
Well, I think that she was great to agree to do the film, because she really doesn't like talking about herself ever. I mean, it's impossible to ask her any questions about herself, and she deflects it immediately onto something else. And she's not particularly kind of reflective in those ways that you sort of want as a character in a documentary. And she really doesn't like kind of cameras on her. So she doesn't even like her name, frankly, so she hates the name of the film, and every time I say it, she cringes. So, there was a lot of resistance, but she agreed to do it. I called her and I said, Sheila Nevins, HBO wants us to do this. Do you want to? And I assumed she would say no, because she hasn't done an interview in 30 years, and I know how much she doesn't like it. And then I thought she could say no to Sheila, and I didn't have to, and then she said, I'll do it. And I was really shocked. I was really, frankly, shocked. But if you ask her, she would say, I did it because Rory asked me to do it, and it would be as simple as that. And I think that's true for her, and that she was doing it largely for me. And since she agreed to do it, I felt like I needed to do it. So we were both sort of in this room together.
Sheila Nevins really got in the.
I know.
Got her foot in the door there.
Yeah, but. She was great, and she was gung ho, and she never complained, and she sat there. I mean, it was an interview that took 5 days, and she was willing to answer every question I threw her way. And there was somebody at the Sundance Film Festival who said, your mother didn't answer the question when you asked her, about your father when he died, and. She does answer the question, I think, in a very profound way, in both her facial expressions as well as, wanting to move on. And that's the answer that's as true as it ever could be for her, because that's how she goes through life. And, so I think even in those questions that were more difficult and certainly very, very hard for me to ask her, I think that she, her response is extraordinary and insightful, and I know, in agreeing to do this, that we would have to cover difficult territory, and so I just, I'm so grateful that I had that experience. I mean, to be able to sit down with your parent and for 5 days ask them every question you've ever wanted to ask.
You'd never had those conversations before?
No.
That's it. Wow.
No, not, I mean, at different levels or different degrees in different ways, but certainly not to that extent and that degree. And, that's a huge gift that I will treasure forever.
Yeah, it's, she's quite, to me, the interview process between the two of you is really the heart and soul of the movie.
Sweet.
It's really, I was very moved by it. I don't know anyone who didn't cry when they saw that movie, but I think a lot of it has to do with sort of your rapport with her and what you're able to get her to bring to the table. So it's a real accomplishment. I want to backtrack again. I meant, again, when I set this up on paper, it was like chronological, but we're hopping all over the place, so whatever. Let's go back to your father for a second and talk about his trip to Appalachia, which right before he ran for president, actually, he went to Western Kentucky and made a very famous visit. And I'm wondering if that impacted your decision on American Hollow when you were looking for a location for that film, and sort of how did his work inspire that project, if at all?
Yeah, no, it definitely did. I mean, I had always been interested in Appalachia. For my father, it was very moving experience. He went down to Appalachia, and really at that point in our country's history, there were very few politicians, if any, who were drawing attention to what was going on in the plight of the poor in Appalachia. And so for him to have that experience, I think really shook him, and to see children in this country who were going hungry. And it was really not, people weren't aware of it in the way, and it's hard to imagine today, but I remember actually reading a follow-up article that Peter Edelman, who worked for my father, wrote about that experience and how he came back and he spoke to the person who was the equivalent of it wasn't called HUD at that point, the Housing and Urban Development, it was called something else, but they were in charge of kind of poverty policy, and they, my father went and met with them, with Peter Edelman, and said, there are people in Appalachia who are going hungry. And the guy said, that's impossible, that doesn't happen in this country. And he said, it's happening and you need to change it. And he said, if it's true, I will. And that's how the food program in schools started, where they started offering food in public schools, and it was because of that trip.
Wow.
So, it was a hugely, and I remember, my siblings talking about the night my father came home from that trip, and he walked into the living room, and it's in the movie, but all of them have talked about it because it really left an impression. And he walked in and he said, do you guys know how lucky you are? And I think that it really impacted him and the person that he evolved into and became, and so for me, I was aware of that and had always been interested in Appalachia, but I'd never visited there, had any experience there, but always wanted to go. And so, I in part probably conceived of the welfare project because of my interest in going to Appalachia, and that felt like a way to approach it that was not necessarily what, kind of an urban example, but maybe less expected, and also showing places where there really are very few jobs, but a kind of hardworking population. And so it certainly, I think, was influenced by my father.
I mean, it was 30 years later, and the situation hadn't changed all that much. I mean, that was one of the shocking things, I think, about the film. Aside from the family being so an amazing subject in the movie, there was not a lot of change. Were you surprised when you got there to see the sort of...
Yeah, I mean, there was, there's definitely huge amounts of poverty. I would say that there's a change in that, it was, I think it's harder to find that level of, like distended stomachs and, real, like, abject poverty at the level that they had in the 60s. So I think it has improved on some level, like at sort of the bottom level,
right?
The bottom of the bottom, but there certainly remains huge challenges, and I think as a country we've kind of gone backwards in terms of. I mean, it's very hard. You really don't hear any politicians today talking about people living in poverty. I mean,
right.
You can talk about the middle class, but nobody is talking about poverty, even the Democrats today, and what to do about people who are really challenged on those levels, and they're an increasingly number with the changes in the economy and whatnot. And so I think that it's important to keep the focus and the attention. If our politicians aren't focusing on it, it's another opportunity for documentaries to step in and try to force the conversation in that direction.
I mean, you made another trip down south for Boy's Life.
Yes.
In Mississippi, which is about child welfare as well. And I had a couple of things about that. One is that, were you pregnant at the time, or you had just given birth? But it was right around the time you became a mother for the first time when that movie came out anyway.
Is that true?
I think so. Okay, so my follow-up question about it having an impact, but becoming a mother yourself, and right at that time you're making a movie about child welfare in the South. I'm just wondering, did that? I guess it didn't register.
Well, I definitely didn't have any kids when I made that film. I can't remember exactly. I feel like, oh yeah, I was. That's true, because I remember being in the edit room and I was pregnant with Georgia. So yes. I think it would have been much harder for me to make that film after I had kids, honestly. I mean, it was, looking back at it now, it's very, very difficult. This was a film that I made. It was also actually my attempt to make a film about welfare reform, which I have yet to really make, but, and turned out to be, my goal was to make a film about the changes in welfare and how it was going to affect people with psychological challenges. And because of the changes, this were changes under the Clinton administration, there were going to be about 100,000 children who were pulled off of the rolls, and no other children were going to be able to have access to medical care and health care who had mental illness. And I had heard about this child who was 7 years old, and he had, by that young age, had killed 4 dogs and 3 cats, according to his therapist, and he had, he was unable to kind of stand in one place for any period of time, and he would kind of hit his head against the wall, and he had tried to commit suicide twice, and he was obviously a very damaged child. And so the film focuses on this young boy, but it turns into kind of a complicated story where the boy then was in the custody of the grandmother, and the grandmother, who you think in the beginning has kind of stepped in to save the day and take the children away from the mother, who's clearly having a hard time, is actually the source of this boy's problems and is causing all of the problems for the child. And ultimately he goes back with his mother, and he's fine, and he's an A student in school. And anyway, it turned out to be a very complicated story that was unfolding as we filmed it over the course of 2 years. And again, it was this experience of having a goal in mind that was very different from the film we ended up making. But it was there are very difficult scenes in the film between the grandmother and the child that, verge on, certainly cross the line on mental abuse and verge on physical abuse too. And it's hard to watch, but again, there are these moments where you feel that it's important to document these cases because they are nuanced and they are complicated, but I think they also can shed light on what's actually happening. And when we're trying to create policies in our country, how do you handle a situation like this, which is probably more normal than not in child welfare cases, and how do you really understand what's going on in a family dynamic, which are always complex.
And I guess the other thing about this movie for me was that it was a return to the South in a lot of ways. Although it's not really an important part of the story, it being Mississippi. I'm wondering, as a Northerner, as a Yankee, yourself, is there something about there's the fence as well, if you think about it, I guess. Something about the South that attracts you or you find interesting as sort of a window into our society as opposed to doing a movie about child welfare in New York City or Chicago?
Well, I'm a Virginia girl.
Oh, okay.
So I'm
Oh,
south
that's
of the Mason-Dixon. So I don't know, I don't know. I mean, I think that for each of the projects, I had a kind of different interest in them and reason that I came to them. But I do think that there's a lot of rich storytelling that is available in the South, and characters and ways to kind of, and there's a lot of focus on the Northeast and in different areas, and I think it's good to diversify and kind of look at things from different perspectives. So, and I enjoy traveling through the South, and I mean, all of those films were great experiences for me.
What about another, I guess, thread through your films are these very strong, interesting, and in some cases, like in Boy's Life, troubling, but women who are sort of at the center of a lot of the movies that you make. Can you talk a little bit about, sometimes when we talk to women filmmakers, it becomes this sort of ghetto where it's women in film, and it's this sort of sidebar where they push over, and the numbers in the film business are staggeringly low for representation of women, from as filmmakers, producers, in executive rooms, everything. I'm just wondering if there's something about women's stories, aside from you being a woman, and I assume a feminist, that draws you to these women in particular when you meet them. And I'm sure each story is different, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think I am, naturally drawn to stories about women. I was a women's studies major, and I am a woman, as you pointed out. And so I think that, there's obviously challenges that women face in this country, and there's, a disproportionate attention to men and resources available to men and over the history of our country. And so I think it's important to continue to, shed light on the plight and the challenges of women, not, I think, and I don't think that you would see it represented over the course of my film so much as victims, as much as understanding the world through a different perspective, or a perspective that most people wouldn't have access to. And so I think that's certainly something that draws me to, is something that draws me to a subject matter. It's certainly not a determining factor. And there are a lot of films I've made that have focused on issues around men as well, but I think that it's certainly something that interests me.
You've also done an amazing number of, I guess a lot of people, after they make a feature film, they never go back to the short film world. They tend to just stick to the feature film length, and that's sort of the grand novelistic statement that they're going to make. But you've really hopped around as a filmmaker. You've done very short films, medium length films, feature films. I'm wondering, like, when you approach a story like The Fence, or I guess the Helen Thomas movie, Thank You, Mr. President, do you define it by this is as long as the story needs to be, and we've told the story? Is it predetermined by sort of the project that you've acquired? How do you decide the projects that you pick, what they're going to end up being like in that regard?
I think, again, it's sort of that question that I continue to ask as I'm starting a film and making a film, of what the film itself wants to be. And I really, I get bored very quickly with films. I mean, not just dramatic films, but or documentaries. I mean, I just, I have a certain attention span, and so I really try not to bore people with my films. And part of it is, figuring out how long a subject wants to be. I mean, a film like The Fence, there was a lot of opportunity to kind of go off subject and make a much bigger film, because we had issues around terrorism, we had issues around the drug war, we had issues around immigration. So, all of those could have been films in and of themselves, but like we had a sign in the edit room, it's the fence, stupid, like keep it to the fence, because there were so many opportunities to go off subject and go into these other issues that didn't necessarily relate entirely to the fence, but were connected to it. And so, at the end of the day, when it was really just focused on the fence, seemed like it wanted to be 40 minutes.
Right.
You know, it didn't want to be an hour and a half. If it had been about all of those other issues, I could imagine it, you know, going longer and going deeper, but then it was becoming something that I didn't really want it to be, and it didn't feel like it wanted to be that.
And when you hand that to Sheila Nevin, she doesn't give you the stink eye and say 40 minutes.
No, because it was conceived of as 40 minutes. And so then it's fine. She's flexible that way, I think. I mean, most of my films, some of them have started as shorts. Like, I think we started Ethel as a short. It may have been 60 minutes. I can't remember if it was 40 or 60, but it certainly got longer, you know, by quite a bit. So, and then I think that was fine. And so very few of the ones that I've conceived of as long have gotten short. Helen Thomas was always a short, and that was a film that HBO had approached me to do as a short.
Can you talk a little bit about your role as a producer and your company? One of the things that I admire about you and Liz Garbus, and whoever was here last year when we showed Searching for Bobby Fischer, that's a film that Rory's company produced that Liz Garbus, her partner, directed. I'm just sort of fascinated by the amount of work that you guys put out, and how I just don't understand how you can produce all those films and direct all the films and be a mother of 3 children and fly all over the world and make your movies. And I'm wondering, as a producer, that role for you, how does that operate because you know the art of making documentaries.
Right.
So what do you bring to the table?
Well, Liz and I have had a great partnership over the last 12 years, and we went to school together. We went to Brown together, and are very close friends, and so it's really been a wonderful, I think, partnership for both of us. And part of the nature of our partnership is, which I think is probably different than most partnerships, is that we kind of bring the exact same talents to the table. So we're both producers and directors, and we both kind of know how to run a company, and you know, we both can go out in the world and kind of do those things. And what helps is that we both can do that and cover for each other when the other one's not around. So it took us a while to kind of figure out how to structure the company, and initially we were directing projects together, which we would still do, but we found that it was better for one of us to really be the person who was in charge of a project, and then the other one could contribute when necessary and when needed. And also, you know, enjoy and the reaps of anything that came out, and the benefits of anything that, you know, that as the project kind of went out into the world, and so that we were both really looking out for each other on every level, because they were our films,
right.
You know. And so I think that how we structured it kind of worked, and has worked for both of us over the years.
Is it a seamless process for you? Sort of you're producing, you're directing, you've got the workflow all set up because of this relationship? Or?
Well, I think, you know, I produce and direct my project, right? So I produce and direct Ghost of Abu Ghraib, and she produces and directs Bobby Fischer, but if she needs help on Bobby Fischer, and you know, there were things that happened along the way. She had a tragedy, her editor died, and you know, so then I kind of step in and help her out during those times, or if there's some strategic decision that needs to be made, you know, I'll jump in, or you know, and then I'll watch cuts, and I won't have been in the edit room every day, and so I'll be able to give feedback that maybe they're not seeing, but anything that they don't want to do, she doesn't have to do it, right? So I can't tell her what to do in that instance, even though I'd like to. And the same with her with me, so she can step in when I need her, but it's, you know, it's my project, and I'm sort of in control of it. And then there are decisions that we have to make as a company of, you know, where our office is going to be and who we're going to hire and all those types of things that we do together.
I have a couple more questions before we turn it over to the audience. One of which is, do you think that you have, as a filmmaker, a style? Would you say that, you know, I don't mean that from like a cinema verite or direct cinema or anything like that, but I mean like a style, like a Rory Kennedy style of filmmaking. When I look at the screen, that's certain things that you care about visually, that are priorities, and you say, this is my work.
Right. That's an interesting question. I don't know that I would be able to define my style per se. I know, for example, my brother Chris would say that I make two types of films, depressing and really depressing. So maybe that's my style, but you know, I don't know. I mean, I think like so many other documentary filmmakers, I try to be very honest with the audience of where I'm coming from and try to get to some sort of truth of some issue that, you know, perhaps hasn't been seen in a particular light before. I mean, that's generally my goal. But I don't know.
You mentioned back to your brother. You mentioned last night in the Q&A that someone asked you about sort of the feedback. Can you talk a little bit about showing Ethel to your siblings and how has that process gone? Because I thought that was sort of an interesting thing, and maybe a little elaboration on everyone's reaction to the movie so far.
Yeah, so I basically finished the film, Ethel, and I locked picture, and then I sent it to my siblings, and then I actually took it to show it to my mother. And I really, you know, I had locked picture, so it wasn't really an opportunity for them to say, you should change this entire film, and what the heck were you thinking? But I did, you know, it was before we had kind of done all the finishing touches in the online and the post houses, and so I wanted to make sure that if there was anything incorrect in the film, and they obviously have access to certain information or certain statements that they made that I want to make sure were true for them, and so I wanted that opportunity, and so I showed it to all of them, or gave them the opportunity to screen it, and showed it to my mother, and they were all amazingly supportive and wonderful, and you know, I think most of them had some experience of just an awkwardness of seeing themselves, but particularly my mother, who I watched it with, who kind of cringed and groaned a lot of the time while she screened it. But she was great about it, and none of them asked me to change anything, and you know, they've been really supportive throughout this process, and I had 26 family members who came to the premiere at Sundance. Right. And which was really nice, including my mother, and so watching it there on stage for the first time, you know, in an audience was really an amazing, I think, experience for everybody, and so I think overall it's been really positive and good.
Have you shown it to your children, or do you plan to?
I showed it Georgia and Bridget, my two oldest, who are 9 and 7, came to the Sundance premiere, and then I've got a 4-year-old who hasn't seen it.
What was their review?
Well, Georgia thought it was really great, and Bridget, you know, I was sort of on a little bit of a high, I have to say, after the premiere, because, you know, it was like 700 people, and they gave a couple standing ovations, and my family was all there, and everybody seemed genuinely moved by it, and everybody was very happy, and, you know, there was like a really nice feeling in the room, and then I kind of weaved my way out, and there was an after party afterwards, and so I got into a car with Georgia and Bridget. And so I said, you know, Georgia, what do you think? And she said, oh, it was so great. And I said, well, Bridget, what did you think? And Bridget said, well, first I was like, huh? And then I was like, what? And then I was like, I'm going to sleep. So that was her review. So any high I had, I was right back onto the planet Earth.
Critics are everywhere.
Yeah.
And then I guess my last question before we turn it over to the house, and I think we're going to have a microphone here in the aisle set up so that folks, if you have a question for Rory, you can line up and ask your question. I did want to ask you about upcoming, I mean, you just sort of gave birth to Ethel. Do you have in your mind projects online for what you're interested in tackling next? Are you ever going to get the welfare reform movie made? What's coming down the pike?
We'll see. I don't have a new project. I really, this one was pretty consuming, so I've been spending more time with my kids, which has been really terrific, and hope to continue to do that for a period of time. I'm talking to HBO, who's asked me to do another project, which is great, and I might start developing that in the fall. So I'll see, but right now I'm enjoying showing this film and having it come out into the world, and being here with you and at this festival, and spending a little more time with my kids, who are awesome.
Great.
Hello. I was wondering, so when you spoke about being an advocate and a woman, we have, 1920s, this first wave of feminism where it's Simone de Beauvoir, and she's writing and pioneering for women. And she's using...
Can you get a little bit closer to the microphone?
Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay. So being an advocate and a woman,
Yeah.
We have this first wave of feminism where it's with Simone de Beauvoir, and she's really pioneering for women. She's using literature as this way of giving women a voice. And now I feel like we're really past that in many, many ways. And now we're with this new medium, and you're really utilizing that. And I really tip my hat to you for that, because people take note of that. And then I'm looking and I'm saying, well, if it's not women so much, who is that voice? Like, where is that? Where do we need to be an advocate? And I'm not familiar with all of your work, so I'm not quite sure if you've done this, but I'm wondering for the future. Children, particularly with our educational system, I really feel like there's a lack for this love of learning. And I'm wondering if you have considered doing this in the future, because you are such an advocate. And it seems that you really do love this idea of getting at the root of an issue. So is this something that you're considering? And I'm just wondering. Thank you.
So to understand the question, am I considering dealing with focusing on the issue of children and learning? Is that your question? Unless do you avoid a rephrase it?
Particularly, I feel like film can also be a way to influence policy and educational policy. So I'm wondering if this is something that you're considering, because I'm gathering.
Do you mean with like Ethel using it as an educational tool, or using other films as an educational tool?
Another film. I'm not even talking about Ethel. I'm just
a film that would deal
her.
with educational issues among young people.
Yes.
I think it's a great idea, but I'm not. That's not an idea that I'm focusing on right now. But certainly, I think that there were a number of documentaries that came out, including Waiting for Superman, and some others that came out recently about kind of education and the challenges of education, and they all had different points of view and perspectives, but I certainly think that they added to an important dialogue on the issue of education. I think there can certainly be more added to the mix in terms of documentaries out there, but it's not something that right now I'm focused on.
Thank you. Do we have other questions?
I'm so glad that you're carrying on the legacy of your family, Rory.
Thank you.
We love to see the Kennedy family faces, their actions, their love of their fellow man. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm from a large Irish Catholic family of 10. So we thought we were Kennedys when we were kids. With our compound in the Adirondack Mountains, we'd go up every year and we'd swim and we'd boat and we'd ski, and we kind of related to your family in that sense, the Irish background. But so thank you for carrying on the legacy, and we love your mom and all of your family and your dad. Thank you.
Thank you, that's so nice.
Rory, it was a great film. The audience was just blown away by it, so thank you very much. It is a great story for my aged generation. One question that I have, when I think of your dad, I think of politics. Actually, when I think of your mom, I think of politics. Of the two of them, who do you think you might have gotten your creative gene from?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that a lot of my family is really creative. My siblings, as well as my mother and father, and my uncles. Teddy was a fantastic painter, and my Uncle Jack was a great painter, and they're all really wonderful writers, and They sing even though they can't really sing, so I don't know if that counts. But, I think that in my family, the arts was always enormously important to us, and was, we were exposed to it. There was an appreciation in our childhood of the arts. We went to museums, and kind of we had every Sunday night we had to memorize poems and read the poems, or not read them, recite them. So I think that there was a culture of creativity that I certainly grew up in, and I think is true for my mother as well as my father in their childhoods as well. So I think they both came to, influenced me on some level, not necessarily directly, but because of just a general culture of love and appreciation for the arts.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to see Ethel tonight, so I'm excited.
Oh, good.
I wondered if you have any activist-type passions deep inside of you that you're thinking about possibly down the road as doing a film or something on.
I think that a lot of the films I've done have come out of a passion for activism, and so I continue to look for projects that, usually the projects that appeal to me mostly are projects about social issues and ones that I think can change the way people understand how other people live and the challenges they face, and hopefully can contribute. I never think that my films in and of themselves, as you kind of mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, can make huge changes, but I certainly think that they can contribute to them, and along with the people who watch them and screen them and hopefully are informed about a particular issue, and whether, it's AIDS or welfare or human rights or a number of the subjects that I've covered, that it opens people's minds to a different way of seeing things. With the pandemic project that I talked about earlier, I remember showing it to Senator Leahy in Washington, and he said after the screening, he said, I had an opportunity to watch this film a couple weeks ago, and I put an extra $50 million in the budget for AIDS in Africa after watching the film about women and AIDS that I did in Africa. So I think that these films can really make a difference and have an impact, and sometimes it's not as tangible as that, but I certainly think that there are ways that it impacts us, and it kind of sometimes on a more nuanced level in terms of the effect that they have, I hope.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. My name's Louise Harrison. And
You're going to need to get really close to the mic. I'm sorry. It's just because it's facing toward you, not us.
Okay.
There you go.
My name's Louise Harrison, and I'm just thinking about getting ready to put together a little thing about my mother as well. She happened to write letters to me from 1956 right through to 1970 when she died, and they were all about my kid brother, who was in a famous band at the time. It was actually, the band was called the Beatles. And so in her letters, she's basically telling the story of the beginning and the middle and up to 1970 of the story of the Beatles. Incidentally, I've just returned to Sarasota because I've just formed a non-profit organization where I have a band which is a Beatle tribute band, and we're going to be raising money at high schools and colleges throughout the country for the music departments, because we know that they're not being funded very well. And one of the last things that my brother did before he died was to help keep music alive, when he did a little PSA for the Mr. Holland's Opus movie. But anyway, I just wondered, do you have any ideas of how one goes about putting together a story about your mum?
Well, it's complicated, but I don't know if I can kind of help you so much in this instance, in this forum. But I think that it's great that you're taking it on, and I think that if you just start reading the letters and kind of exploring it, and what I find is that it sort of finds itself, and in interviews and talking to people, and get the camera out and start shooting.
Yeah.
is really what I recommend, and really just get it going, and then things become clearer, I think, as you get the information.
Incidentally, I met your brother, Bobby. Wasn't he the one that was working on the rivers around about
Yes.
New York?
Yes, my
yeah,
brother
I met
Bobby.
him one time when I was back in the 90s. I had an environmental organization, and I met him at that time, and we did a lot of talking about the rivers.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
he's terrific.
Well, thank you very much.
I'll tell him hi for you.
And then we have time for, I guess, a couple more questions. One here, and then if anyone else had a final question, you can come right up.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Okay, if you just put it right close to your mouth.
Okay. I enjoyed the film last night, and one of the curiosities I had is you're a wonderful storyteller, and obviously your family is, and I think of writing and the arts. Why did you choose film, and do you really think about the images you're going to put together when you want to tell that story? Is it in images or words?
So when you're conceiving the project visually, or?
Yeah, I think that, for this project, I really went through the archive very deeply before doing any of the interviews. And so in that way, I think that the visual story kind of drove it for me on this project. And the fact that, my mother was at so many of these significant historical events, and wanting to hear from her what it was like and what that experience was like, and kind of going back through this history. So I think in that way it was sort of driven visually, but then there's also, you have to kind of create a narrative arc in any film to kind of keep people engaged, and so to figure out what was her story, and how her story kind of paralleled my father's story, and then how she sort of went on to make her own life, and how that was going to work in the course of the film, and trying to figure out all of those pieces was also, obviously a driving challenge of the film.
I was thinking what you said about her language more or less answered the question. And I think the body language and some of the visual things like that tell a story, and that's how film is so powerful. Yeah. And I was just wondering how that related to other films as well.
That you've done.
I would say that for me, one of the techniques that I fall on to a lot is when I'm doing interviews, is I ask a question and then somebody might answer it, and then I'll wait. And I won't, there's kind of awkward silences that happen in those moments. And I have found that in those awkward silences is where you get the best responses. And sometimes those are just body language, and then sometimes it's people uncomfortable with the silence, and so they say things that they otherwise wouldn't, or, wouldn't, yeah. So I think that is sort of entering that same territory of kind of where film can speak in a way that other mediums can't access.
I mean, one of the things about the movie, you use a lot of still photographs and a lot of archival film to underscore points that are not necessarily literally directly related to the image. You'll say my mother was isolated and there's a beautiful picture of her by herself. It's not the moment that's necessarily being described. I mean, you're using the sort of visual aspect of the images themselves to underline the emotional content of what's being said.
Yes. I think that's true, and I think that it, maybe like at the end of the film where I'm talking about their relationship, and it's just kind of images after he's died of them holding hands kind of together is more evocative than it is literal, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And then a final question here, ma'am.
Okay, yes, thank you. The movie was just lovely. To have that love amongst all your family is really incredible. And my question is, the wonderful faith that has been throughout your family, is that being passed down? And I'm just curious because everyone is so strong. And I think the love of family and the faith probably is. I'm just curious about that. And then my second question is, how do you love our beautiful city of Sarasota, your first visit here? Thank you.
I love Sarasota. It's been wonderful. And it's been totally enjoyable. You know, I would say certainly the love of family has passed down through generations, and you know, I think that people have gone different ways in terms of their religious beliefs. I think there's certainly a experience that we all share of a Catholic faith that we all share, but I think that people of younger generations and different generations have kind of pursued that to different degrees. I mean, a number of my siblings go to Mass every Sunday. My mother goes to Mass still every day. I don't go to Mass very much. I personally have more issues with the Catholic Church and the treatment of women and, you know, kind of other issues. So I think it's changed over time, but I think we all have an appreciation of the idea of faith, and, you know, of our I think, experience that we all share growing up, having gone to church, having seen my mother and her belief system, and have all been influenced by that, including, you know, the grandchildren, and now they're a couple of great-grandchildren. They're less than 1 year old, so I can't really speak for them yet, but I think it'll be passed down. Thank you all so much. Also, I just wanted to let you know we do have a website, you know, Ethel the Movie, and a Twitter and Facebook page, and so they all have announcements of where the film's showing at a number of festivals, and will be broadcast on HBO in October, so I encourage you to send anybody who you want to see the film in that direction, and we'll keep folks informed.
Are you guys planning, just a last question, are you planning to do a qualifying run for the movie, I hope?
I hope so.
For the Oscars?
I hope so.
Yeah, great. It's so great having you here. We really appreciate it.
It's so great being here, Tom. Thank you.
Rory Kennedy. Thank you. How about yours?